Hi, I'm Suzanne Turner, and welcome to a podcast delving into the personal narratives within the clinical research industry. Through candid interviews, we'll learn about the personal journeys and motivations of individuals who have chosen this profession, what I like to call their why. This podcast is not just for industry insiders. It's for everyone curious about the human side of healthcare. Beyond the industry's negative reputation, we'll shed light on the dedicated professionals behind clinical trials. Join us as we uncover the heart and passion of those working tirelessly behind the scenes in clinical research. Welcome to Heart of the Trial. Well, hello, lovely listeners. I'm your host, Suzanne Turner, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to Heart of the Trial, where we uncover the human stories within clinical research and shed a positive light on the pharmaceutical industry. Today's guest is Sam Rolfe, and we are going to be talking about the software needed to manage the documents and data of a clinical trial. So welcome to the show, Sam.
Thank you, Suzanne. It's a real pleasure to be here today.
Awesome. So let's start by telling our guests what it is that you do and how that connects to clinical research.
Good, thank you. So I've always worked in the software side, supporting pharmaceutical companies. And last year I joined an organization that is offering a single one-stop shop, really, to archive all of your clinical data and documents at the end of a study, but not just putting it somewhere, making sure that you can actually read and use that data 25 or 30 years into the future. And it's quite a challenge because if you think back 25 years, the world was a very different place. The global communication landscape, the IT landscape, we were thinking about the millennium bug and dial-up internet. Fast forward 25 years to where we are today, things are totally different. And who knows what the world will be like in 25 years from now. But what we do know is you might need to reuse that data.
Right. And let's talk about why that's important. So tell our listeners why being able to access the documents or data in 5 years or 10 years or 25 years might be important.
Yeah, there's a number of reasons why pharmaceutical and biotech companies need to keep that data for such a long period. The primary reason is regulation. These organizations are governed by regulations, and you might have heard of the FDA in the United States, Food and Drug Administration, or the European Medicines Authority, or the MHRA in the UK. And the regulations have changed in recent years. Organizations now are required to keep that data and the sets of documents relating to their clinical trial for 25 years or even 30 years in cell and gene therapy. Other regulations state that you have to keep your data in original formats, but also legible and usable 25, 30 years into the future. So when we kind of combine those two, it creates a challenge because, like I said, we don't know what the world will be like in 25 years. So we're really here to help kind of mitigate risk and protect the most valuable data that a pharmaceutical or biotech company owns, which is their clinical trial data, how they got that drug to the market.
Yeah. And
so regulation is one.
And no, go ahead, because I was going to say another side of that is that when a pharmaceutical company is working on a program, they may have this one study and then later add additional studies that they need to be able to go back and get that data. And I'm thinking about, so when I first entered the industry, and I've been in for over 11 years now, where we would send sponsors their TMF on a CD, a disc, which now you can't. The majority of laptops, I'd say 98% of laptops don't even have anywhere where you can put a disk drive in to access it. So being able to access that data is huge.
Precisely. The reality is, Suzanne, that's still happening today to some
Oh my
extent.
God.
CDs and DVDs are still flying around at the end of the study.
Wow.
But like you say, I couldn't open a
Yeah.
CD today without maybe going onto Amazon and
Like
buying
an
a drive and
external
et cetera, et
one that
cetera.
that plugs in. Yeah. And then those are even
And
erasable. Like they can go bad and erase, right? Which when
they have a shelf
yeah.
life. If that CD sits on a shelf for 10 years, will it still open when you go back
Which
to
is really
it?
scary.
Who
Yeah,
knows?
because then
And that's a
yeah,
risk,
because
right?
then they could be non-compliant. They could be non-compliant or they need to access well, because they could be inspected, right? Too because the if the MHRA or FDA show up at their door, even if it's not an active study, they can ask to look at it. Or, in a previous episode, I was talking to a guest about things that have been pulled post market, and
Mm.
so they may want to go and look back at that data then. So that's really really cool. And so I'm curious, how did you get into this, Sam? Did you just walk out of high school and you're like, I'm going to find a way to to get into system management with clinical trials?
Good question, and not quite. There's been a few steps along the journey.
Yeah.
But I think like a number of people who enter this industry, I kind of fell into it. I'd done a sports science degree at
Wow.
university and kind of fell into a help desk role
Wow.
at a software company who was providing a content management, a document management tool for pharma and biotech companies, actually at the other end of the process. Once the drugs get to market, they were providing a system that managed the medical and commercial
Right.
documents
Okay.
for promoting those drugs to doctors. Um, that company was acquired by a much bigger organization who was providing a lot of different software in a kind of end-to-end platform to help companies develop their drugs all the way through the clinical trial process and then take it into market. I kind of naturally was drawn towards the clinical side of things. I could see from the very start that the need for software to manage this process, the clinical trials, was only going to increase. Trials were getting more complicated.
Mm-hmm.
There was more data, more ways of collecting this data from patients. And on a personal level, I felt that clinical trials connected with me on a personal level. There was a more direct impact on
Mm-hmm.
patients. New treatments in unmet medical needs are being put in the hands of patients during the clinical trial. And the faster that you can run those trials, still safely, still with the right quality, the sooner you can get that drug into the hands of a much wider patient population who need it once the drug's been approved.
Right.
And the tiny part that I can contribute along that process is really meaningful. It adds meaning to my work and my day-to-day life, which is really cool.
That's really amazing. So, as you went through that shift where you wanted to focus on clinical trials, that's when you really kind of entered the industry, and you started out working with a company that really were developing electronic TMF. Is that correct?
Yeah, they were one of the, not the first, but one of the first companies to provide a purely dedicated electronic trial master file system. And I was kind of at the forefront as that solution was being brought to the wider market. So it was really exciting because we were solving a challenge for the
Mm-hmm.
industry.
Oh yeah.
In the past, these clinical trials had been managed on paper
Yes.
documents. They might have started as Word docs, but they were printed and filed as paper.
Yes.
And it was very clear to me that the world was moving on, um, both from a general technology perspective, but also the industry's desire to go electronic was
Yeah.
there. So it was a really exciting time to be part of it. I learned a lot in that time. But most importantly, I realized that I could help
Yeah.
companies to solve this challenge, to bring those drugs to market more quickly. And then as I got into clinical in more detail, I realized that, wow, there's actually so much more that goes into
Yeah.
this. There are dozens, if not hundreds of different pieces of software that might be used during a
Mm-hmm.
clinical trial. But it all kind of comes back to that central trial master file, which is the consolidated piece of documentation that explains how the trial's been run.
Right. Yeah, and I can say as an end user, um, being able to have an electronic TMF system is so amazing, because when I entered the industry, it was fully paper, and we had these giant rooms just full of them, folders. There was of course a filing system and all, but yes, those documents were printed. So we had an area where that was their job. Those individuals were assigned to printing the documents, and then it came to like myself, who would code them, scan them, and then go file them. And this led to a couple things, right? Because also, without an electronic system, how, if I'm in Kansas and you're in the UK, do you look at the documents that I have, right? So that makes it hard for team members to talk to each other. So those systems are really valuable. So it's amused me when you're like, if I can help just a little bit, and it's like, you're helping probably way more than just a little bit. And now you've kind of shifted out of that into the end of the study, because now you really focus on the archival of all that, like you said, all that data and documents that end up gathered all together in the trial master file and the archival of it.
Yeah, there's so much that goes into running a clinical trial. It's really hard. It's a really difficult, challenging, organized process that companies go through to complete clinical trials. And for me, the missing piece was at the end. Mm-hmm. What actually happens to all that data, to all those documents, once the study's over and potentially your drug has then been approved or advanced to the next phase of clinical trial? What do you do with that? Because traditional storage systems, your data just sits there, and it's a risk. In the same way that there is risk of flood, fire and theft of paper documents, there's risk that your data, if you're just storing it in a file share, could be corrupted in the background. You might lose integrity on those documents. We've all, opened, to use a kind of funny analogy, we've all opened holiday snaps from a decade ago where the bottom half of the photographs disappeared.
Yes.
What happened?
Yes.
Right?
Oh my gosh.
We all have that real life situation, but what happens if that's a clinical trial document that a doctor has signed and the missing piece holds that doctor's signature?
Oh my gosh, yeah.
That's a real problem.
Yeah.
And how would you know? How would you know until you actually open that document? Well, you might not know. And what if it's an FDA inspector opening that document? That creates a real challenge for your business. So I think there's a real need in the industry to preserve that data for the long term.
Yeah.
And the first thing we spoke about that drives companies to do this is regulation. The second is the potential for reuse. You mentioned companies testing the same molecule, the same drug, on different diseases or different indications. The same treatment might be able to treat different types of cancer, for example, but you might only run a trial on a type of cancer, and you might reuse that drug on a different type of cancer that might also be effective. Well, that's not always a step-by-step approach. You might find that mechanism of action works on a different cancer indication 10 years from now.
Yeah, right. And if you can't access your data,
you're going to have to start from scratch. Yeah. But if you can access the safety data, the dose tolerability data, you might get straight into a later phase study.
Wow.
So it can really help these biotechs and pharma companies to accelerate the speed of drug development when they're repurposing those drugs for different indications or different populations, different demographics within the patient population. So yeah, there's a lot of value, but I think traditionally archiving is kind of seen as this thing that happens that no one really knows what's going on. You put your stuff somewhere We might be able to find it in the future, and that's the best we can hope for. Dusty filing rooms, etc. And what we're trying to do here is really shift that narrative from the cost of archiving data to what's actually the value of preserving it into the future for your business. And I think that's a real mindset change for the industry that we're trying to lead.
Yeah, that's really amazing. And I like how you brought up if they're going to repurpose that data, because in a previous episode, we talked about when we were talking about safety, how they, found completely different uses for like how Rogaine came about and how Viagra came about. And they'd have to be able to access that data, even though they're running a new trial. So I just love that. And what would you say? So if there's like a biotech out there that's starting their first study, or they're entering a new phase when it comes to this, and when it comes to their systems, like what would your advice for them be?
Good question. There's a lot that biotechs need to think about, of course, as they're entering kind of their first wave of clinical studies. The first thing I would think about is, what's your outsourcing strategy? Not just in terms of the operations, who are you going to contract with as partners to help you run the study, but what's your technology strategy? Mm-hmm. And, as a small biotech, you've translated a medicine from a PhD project or from the lab and now you're ready to run a clinical trial. You might not have thought that far ahead. What's our IT strategy to run the study? But now's the time to think about it. Are you going to outsource the operations and the technology? Or are you going to bring the technology in-house and ask your partners to use it? There's not necessarily a right or wrong answer, and I think every company differs. My general view on this is that outsource risk early.
Yeah.
Let your partners take the majority of the risk with the cost of the technology, the use of the technology. They're probably quite familiar with the software that they're using as they support other customers, other sponsors. And they have that expertise. So I would lean on your partners early when you're going into phase 1 studies, for example.
Yeah.
As your pipeline develops, that's when you really start to think about, do we bring this technology in-house? Maybe we've got multiple studies and it's easier for us as a business to manage different studies at different phases with different partners in our own technology. One thing I would try and avoid is moving your ETMF or your clinical trials from one system to another while the study's going on. Even if the studies are long term, it's late phase, it's taking many years to complete, it might seem like a good idea, but it's really challenging.
Really risky.
It's risky, right? There's migration of the data, there's validation of the new system, there's training of the users on the new system. And if you are going to introduce a new ETMF system or new clinical systems into your business, I think really hard about starting new studies only.
And
letting the current studies play out where they are.
Yeah, I actually think that's really good advice too, because it's so risky and difficult to go through that process. But you mentioned something that I think would be a really great topic to touch on, and that's validation. So with these systems, so our listeners are not just individuals in the industry. They're going to be the everyday person. So they may not realize that it's not as simple as like a sponsor can't just say like, oh, I want to use this system. Like they have to ensure, like you said, being regulatory controlled and having the oversight. They have requirements for these systems that are managing this data. And we're not talking just ETMF. We're talking the data management, the safety data, the everything and all, which means validating the system. Can you talk a little bit about that and why that's so important?
Yeah, it's a great topic, Suzanne, and validation is often seen as a bit of a scary topic by the industry. Rightfully so, I think. It's challenging, it's time consuming, it's granular. In the public domain, if I purchase a new podcast application to listen to podcasts, I buy it, I use it straight away. In a highly regulated industry like pharmaceuticals and biotechs, you've got to make sure that system works as intended. You can't click on buttons and have unexpected results. End of story. So pharmaceutical companies, through their IT and their quality assurance departments, have to perform this computer systems validation on their regulated software. So an HR system used by pharma doesn't need GXP validation because they might just have purchased that HR solution payroll system that can be used by any company, any industry. Fine. To run a clinical trial, you need to make sure that every action you perform in the system provides a predictable, expected result. So companies spend a lot of time building scripts to say, I click on button A and thing B happens. Does that work? Check the box, move on to the next step. As I say, it's granular, it's time consuming, but it's super important because if companies are trying to develop a drug and bring it to market safely, effectively, and their computer systems that they're using to do that are not performing as they expect it to, are producing unexpected results, that could put your whole trial at risk. That could put the whole study, the whole program in jeopardy, not least delaying the approval. It could actually stop your approval if your systems haven't been validated.
And part of that process is also ensuring that the data is safe, right? That because the goal of any trial is always to protect the human, right? So we're collecting very sensitive data from these volunteers, these patients. And so being able to keep that data safe is another key part of that.
Yeah, and like you say, the whole reason we run clinical trials is to ensure the safety of the patients taking the drug. How do you prove that? It's through the data you collect during the clinical trial, the safety data around the drug, the profile. Are we seeing adverse events? Maybe we're expecting some adverse events. People getting headaches while they take a new drug is pretty common. But we also have to pick up trends. It's really interesting how, and I know you talked about this in one of your recent podcasts, so I won't rehash all of that, but how that safety profile of the drug is built up over the course of multiple clinical studies so that you can prove that this is safe, not just in humans, but at this dose, taking it repeatedly, taking it with other medication that you might be taking it with. And then even once the drug goes into the market, you need to keep collecting that data because different population types, different demographics will start taking the treatment. They might be taking medications that you haven't tested it against during the clinical trial. And so having all of that data from the clinical trial process preserved for the long term means that, again, you can start combining all of this data into big data in the future. And that might create new opportunities to analyze those big data sets to identify unexpected risk or unexpected opportunity.
Do you feel like you're seeing, I'm just curious from someone who is very system focused, are you seeing things in the industry that you're like, this is something really cool that I think is where it's going with the system capabilities? Anything like that?
I think there's a general trend in clinical trials, as I mentioned at the very start, to produce more data from different sources. Traditionally, as the electronic trial management came into effect, patients would go and visit hospitals. They would get their treatment. They would provide data to the clinical trial hospital, to the investigator who's running the study. They would take blood draws, lab results, etc. And then COVID happened. and hospitals shut around the
Yeah.
world, but the clinical trials didn't stop.
Mm-hmm.
Or some of them might have paused, but the reality is you've got sick patients who need treatment and there's a clinical trial ongoing. It's just the hospital's shut.
Yeah.
So that created this really interesting scenario where everybody was looking at what they call decentralized
Mm-hmm.
trials, where the hospital's no longer the hub of the study. It's actually your home
Yeah.
that's the hub of the
Yeah.
study. I thought that was really interesting because it forced organizations to be a bit more patient centric during their clinical trials. But it also created challenges around the validity and integrity of that data.
Mm-hmm.
Well, how can we be sure that that wearable device that you're using is accurate, is calibrated
Mm-hmm.
correctly? If we're doing how do we know that you haven't stuck that wearable device on your dog and sent it around the garden to do to do some
Yes.
running? To say, I got my
Yes.
step count
Yes.
up today as part of the trial.
Yes.
That is a real life example I've heard from a clinical
Oh
data
my
management
gosh.
person. All of a sudden, step count spiked. He'd put it on his dog to let it run
Oh my
outside.
gosh.
So it created new challenges
That's
for
a
the industry, and
huge
this is why we
challenge.
need the validation on the software. Can you use a Fitbit to collect data on a clinical trial? How accurate is that data? If you and I wear a Fitbit, are we getting exactly the same result from both? We would hope so, but we need to validate it.
Right.
And then that all leads into today where we're more in the phase of hybrid trials. Things have gone back a little bit, hospitals are open again, patients are going
Yeah.
in, but the drug development companies have realized that they can collect extra data to support the approval of that drug, the safety, the efficacy, how well it works, by also interacting with patients when they're at home
Mm-hmm.
through diaries and pain scales and things like this, as well as the wearable devices. And that's really proliferated the amount of data that's being collected in any one trial. And that data is coming from all different sources. And decentralized trials need centralized data at the end.
Yeah.
And at the end of the trial, when you've got all this stuff spread around and you're packaging it up to send off to the authorities, where do you archive it? Do you archive it in 5 different
Yeah.
locations? Or do you need to put it in one place for the future?
Yeah. And so I just for listeners, I think this is the first time this word has come up so far in the podcast. So I want to touch on it and where you said efficacy. And efficacy is really a big deal. And I think it's what's led to a lot of questioning in the last few years as we've gone through COVID and everything. And efficacy is pretty much the simplified definition. I just looked it up to make sure I was getting it spot on, but it's the ability to produce the desired or intended results. So when people are talking about the efficacy of the trial, they're just saying, like, is it doing what we intended it to do? Right. So I just wanted
Does the drug
Yes,
work?
does it work? And then the systems, same thing with the systems, is the systems giving you those outputs. So can you trust it, pretty much, right? So I just think it's really cool that you threw that word out there, because I think that's something that will probably come up again in the future, since it's a big deal in trials, right?
Yeah, it's a very industry
Yes.
term, but it is one that is used a lot in the context of clinical trials and is this drug working? Because it's not just, is the drug working? Is the drug working better than the placebo
Yeah.
arm? Is the drug working better than other treatments that are already on the market?
Right. Or
And that's where the
by
efficacy
taking
comes
this
from.
one drug that is already approved and on the market and adding this other drug to it, is it even better? Like, so in the US, obviously they run advertisements, and I've noticed lately quite a few of them where that's the case, where it's like, especially I think depression ones, like, if this works better, like, you're already successful on this, but it's not like as good as you want it. So with the addition of this, it makes it even better, which, again, if that's the case and you're using a previous approved drug on the study you're on, they have, when they're running clinical trials, they have to submit that information to the regulatory authority. They have to say, right, that we're performing. I'm actually experiencing this now with clients. Like we're testing this drug and we're using these approved drugs with it. Well, that opens up those studies again to inspection and everything again as well. So again, where this data and being able to access it for 25 years comes into place. It's like the perfect example of why it's so important to not only have systems that work and collect the data as you need and be able to manipulate it to get trends and overall results, but then to keep it safe at the end of the study. So like, what would you say? Because you're choosing to do this, I think it's very clear you're very passionate about it. So, like, what is it that you enjoy the most, or like has made you so passionate about it?
It goes back to helping people.
Yeah.
At the end of the day. There is an outcome here, which is getting better drugs into patients' hands safer and faster.
Yeah.
And in recent years, I've had family members and friends who have had to enter clinical trials.
Really?
And it really makes it all the more meaningful, because you can see that if there weren't clinical trials, there would be no treatment. There would be no more research into this. That would kind of be the end of the line. And it's just it creates meaningful work for me. There's a lot of bad press. I think the Heart of the Trial is a really good name for the podcast, because people get into clinical research because they can.
Yes.
There's a lot of bad press around. Bad pharma, big pharma, out for profit, not doing the right thing for patients. The reality is the boots on the ground, the people running clinical trials in the hospitals, the people who are collecting and managing the data and the documents related to those clinical trials, they're doing it because they care, because they want to help people, they want to help patients, and they want to make the world a better place. They're not thinking about how much is the profit margin going to be on this drug when we get it into the market. That just doesn't enter the minds of people running clinical trials.
It doesn't.
And I think there's a misconception in the public at times, which in my opinion is at times caused by a lack of communication from the life sciences industry. There was a lot of concern from the public around how fast the COVID vaccines were brought to market. And that's understandable. The average person isn't familiar with the timeline of drug development, that what goes into it. They know it takes a long time, and now it didn't take a long time. That seems risky. That feels uncomfortable. What the industry didn't really communicate, in my opinion, is that people in hospitals during COVID were working 16-hour days, 7 days a week. That's how it happened. People pulled together in this industry. We talk about, the essential workers. These were all essential workers. They were both treating the COVID patients, running COVID studies, and running other studies at the same time. They were doing 16-hour days all the time, if not longer. And I think if the industry just communicated a little better to the public about how this all happened, there would be a lot less conspiracy and fear and uncertainty in the public domain about, are these treatments really safe?
I really agree with that communication part a lot, because also many of these studies, they weren't, we've talked about, and on some of the episodes about the different phases of studies, and these were not phase one, just beginning type studies. These COVID studies, they'd actually been working on them for years in different ways, and it just upped the priority, right? Because every company is going to have no matter how many drugs they have going, they always have their priority studies. They always do. And
Yeah.
so it upped that priority. And my understanding, at least with some of them, is that they had, again, talking about the data, or they had kind of a starting point, maybe with a different type of trial, and they shifted that because a lot of them used the I'm always worried I'm going to mess this up because it's like the rDNA or something, where they're using, what's within your body already. So
Mm.
I think communication is a huge issue in the industry, but I'm sure part of that is because there we both know there's a lot of proprietary and secretive things these companies like to keep, but I think that
Yeah.
they don't always think of what is safe and comfortable and necessary to tell the public about it. But yeah, I think communication
Yeah.
is a huge issue. So I think that's amazing that you that even though like you don't work in the trials, like that you're still providing a service that helps the industry, and it's
Mm.
clear you are very passionate about it, and I agree with you completely. Thank you so much for getting what I'm trying to do, because yeah, I'm just trying to show that there's so many of us that truly care. And when you work on a study, I don't know if you've had this experience since you kind of work on the backside or the after part, is when you're on a study and you're actually seeing the results and you're seeing it improve lives. It's such a crazy feeling. I worked on a study where they were working with individuals. I cannot go into a lot of detail, of course, but pretty much the
No.
individual had no ability to do really anything. And they were actually able to show us a short video of the effects after a treatment, and they could sit up on their own, even if it was for only 15-20 seconds or something. And I remember like a coworker of mine like messaging me on Teams, and she's like, I'm crying, like she like
Yeah.
seeing the impact this has. Um, and I actually, if you don't mind me sharing a story that this makes me think of,
Please.
is so when I actually first started, I was at a CRO, and it was, like I said, full paper back when I started. And I worked on this study that it was actually called a compassion study. Are you familiar with those?
Mm.
Yes. So for our
Compassionate
listeners,
use. Yeah.
a compassion study is when they know that drug is never going to be approved because it doesn't get the results that it needs. However, it is having an impact on and helping certain individuals, and therefore they keep this study open. And so this is another thing, like this isn't talked about, and this is amazing. They keep these studies open. They're spending probably millions of dollars on it to help those few patients that they can. And the one I happened to be on was they were individuals who it was keeping them alive. The drug was keeping them alive. It was
Mm.
extending their life by like 6 months to a year. And so this drug was just all they had. And so they would continue to enroll some patients. And it was a weird situation because, like, literally, we were continuing the study just waiting for the last patient to die. Pretty much that's what we were waiting around for them to be able to close it and wrap it up. But they would add randomly still some new individuals. And that study had been going on. I was working there in, I think this would have been around 2012 or so. And that study had been going on since like 2001. And
Yeah.
it's kind of mind blowing. But I think that's just another way to kind of show the positive thing. Like, they were spending this money on this drug knowing it was never going to prove. So they were never going to get this money back. And that's why it's called a compassion study. And it kind of makes me think again of this data that and these systems to be able to have something to hold that and keep it available. And that it just kind of made me think of that as you were talking about it. So I wanted to share my experience with the compassion
Yes.
study. Yeah.
It's a beautiful story, and again, I wish it was something that the
Yeah.
industry communicated better to the
Yeah.
public. You've had to explain what a compassion study is to the
Yes.
public on your
Yeah.
podcast because the industry hasn't done a good enough job of
Yeah.
doing it, in my opinion.
I never heard of it until I was in the industry. Never heard of it. So, and I mean, there are a lot of them out there because, like,
Yeah.
I was kind of explaining, I think, in my first episode, how these companies run all these trials and they could be running 10 trials and only one of them is successful. And
Mm.
so, because of that, and how many pharmaceutical companies are out there and all, there have to be tons of compassion studies, and no one knows anything about them unless they're the one in the situation where they're suddenly in need of it.
And to combine a couple of those topics that we've talked about here, a compassionate use study for a treatment that isn't going to be approved. But if you archive that data and you really store it
Yeah.
securely so that you can reuse it in the future, maybe there's an opportunity to combine it with another drug
Yeah.
and then get a treatment that can get
Right.
approved in
Or
the
maybe
future.
future
But if you've,
technology that will make it like, this is the little bit that it was missing, but if we can fix that. Yeah.
who could predict where we'll
Yep.
be 25 years from
Yeah.
now?
That's true.
And
Mm-hmm. And I've seen,
yeah.
because individuals and the public may not know this too, but companies buy drugs from each other. So,
All the time.
yes.
All the
So
time.
I had that with the client where they had a program that it wasn't getting the results they wanted, or at least when the FDA did their review of it, they, because again, to run a trial in a country, they have to have regulatory approval. So when the FDA was doing the review of it, it wasn't that they weren't going to allow it, but the things that had to be done were going to be very costly. And it was a very small sponsor.
Yeah.
So they actually put it up for sale. So then another company could come in and take that data, take those documents, take it all, and have a starting point to then move forward with it. So again, it just shows the importance of having good data and systems that can handle it. And probably not something individuals think of when they think of clinical trials is all the systems that go into it, which I'm sure in some other podcasts we'll get into even more detail, because the number of systems can get, like you said.
I think we call it the spaghetti diagram.
Yes. Oh my gosh.
Of all these different systems and the lines
I've
connecting
seen some
them and how it all
crazy
interacts.
diagrams for systems, because that's the other thing we haven't even touched on much, which we're going to have to wrap up soon, but is these systems, some of them can talk to each other, others can't. And that's like a whole nother can of worms.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've gone from the 3 companies I've worked for in my career in this arena have been a single product company that does one thing, and then a platform that does everything and talks to each other, and then back to a single product company, because there won't be ever one company with one set of technology that does everything you'll ever need.
Some of
You'll
them are
always
trying.
need those little bits to fill the gaps. They are, and they're doing a pretty good job, but it's such a hard undertaking.
Yes.
It's such a massive
It is.
effort. And the world will continue to evolve.
Yes.
The way we run trials will continue to evolve. And other small companies will think of new things and provide new little bits of innovation in the software that helps this little process happen 20% faster. Now that might shave 2 days off your trial. That might mean that a patient gets a treatment 2 days sooner, and that might save their life. It might also make that company a lot of money in revenue getting it to the market 2 days sooner. So there's both sides.
Yes, of course. Oh my goodness. Well, this has been a fantastic discussion, Sam. Hopefully our listeners now understand a little bit of the behind the scenes stuff that goes into managing all the data and the trials. So before we sign off, can you tell our listeners how they can reach out to you if they want to contact you?
Yeah. Of course. You can find me on LinkedIn. It's Sam Rolfe, with a little cloud after my name, because I've always worked in cloud software technology and I'm a bit of a nerd like that. You can also contact me on my work email. It's sam.rolfe at archivum.com. All of my contact information is on my LinkedIn profile. There's even a place you can book a meeting.
Awesome. And I'll have that information in the show notes also. So thank you again so much for your time, Sam. I hope you have a great rest of your week. And in the US, actually, while we're recording this, 4th of July is coming up. So I don't know if you have any celebrations, but if so, I hope you enjoy them.
My mother is from North Carolina, so we have a little celebration
That's so
of our own.
Cool. Okay. It's not awkward because as I'm sure our guests can hear, you're British.
It's water under the bridge, Suzanne. It's been a couple hundred years. We're fine now.
That's so cool that you guys get to do that little bit of celebration with your mom. Oh, well, thank you again so much. Really have a good one, Sam.
It's been an absolute delight joining you, Suzanne. Thank you so much for having me.
This brings us to the end of today's episode. I want to extend my sincere thanks to our guest for sharing their inspiring journey. If you'd like to connect with them, you can find their contact information in the show notes. I also want to express my gratitude to you for joining us on this exploration of the clinical research industry. I hope you found today's episode insightful. If so, please consider leaving a review on your favorite podcast platform. It truly helps us reach more listeners. If you have any feedback, questions, or comments about the show, feel free to email me at podcast@iceconsultingllc.com. Thank you once again, and I look forward to having you joining us on our next episode of Heart of the Trial.